all my treatments are geared towards what is the primary root issue and what do we do to actually, help achieve better balance there. So, yeah, so I mean, we do that all the time. And that's my main area of research is autism, but especially, working with the non-speaking autistic community and trying to help them to communicate or get their voice and not lose their genius.
Yeah, they're in there.
Oh, more than you can imagine.
Yeah, yeah. So, maybe you can just start with telling us about your journey into medicine and then specifically autism.
Okay, so for me, my journey into the healthcare world really started with my own personal interest. I was an athlete growing up, and I got very interested in health and nutrition. I also, struggled with certain injuries and things like that. And early on, like most people, I was exposed to many different forms of healthcare and medicine. My parents had a very open mentality and were very holistic in their thinking from the beginning. They were kind of ahead of their time. And, one of the people that really influenced me and treated me a lot, especially with my athletic injuries, was a chiropractor. So when it came time, I fell in love in high school with anatomy and physiology. And I wanted to go into the healthcare field and really wanted to help other athletes like myself. And so I really, decided that the person that helped me the most was a chiropractor, and I resonated with that. I didn't really resonate with medication and a lot of traditional medicine. And so I went into that. And when I was there, I fell in love with neurology and neuroscience. Most people don't realize that chiropractic is founded in neurology and neuroscience and really were the first healthcare profession to really be founded in that. And so for me, that kind of really, then in my mind, I wanted to kind of combine some way of working with neurology and neurological issues, but in a holistic, but also rehab, almost sports medicine type of way. Um, and so that started me on a lot of my research. And then when I graduated, I went and got a subspecialty in neurology, clinical neurology, and then rehabilitation. And then I started teaching it. And then I went into clinical rehabilitation neuropsychology because I wanted to understand the brain better and look at ways of measuring it functionally because I was developing a functional approach to really understanding what was happening in the brain and how to change it. And then as I developed that and it was going really well, one of my children was diagnosed with ADHD, and a lot of my patients have been asking me about ADHD and autism. And I really didn't know a lot about it. So I really wanted to understand what was happening in my own child's brain and, if there were ways that I could help him. And that really started me on a 35-year journey, a 30-year journey of really understanding what is happening in the brain. It eventually led me to develop a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience to really understand human brain development at the highest level and how it all worked. But it really was always from the beginning, how do we do something to help? What can we do to improve function? Not change the individual. All three of my kids had different neurodivergent issues and are also unbelievably gifted in other ways, but really to help them to minimize anything they struggle with and not take away their gifts or their talents. And that's where my work has really revolved around.
Yeah, it's important that these gifts and talents be cultivated, and I think that's one of the biggest harms, things that are neglected. I think in society, in many different factors, aspects of it, are the harms of it.
Yeah, I think understanding the nature of the gift neuroscience wise also leads to vulnerabilities. So the gift, from an early age, there was a saying, I don't know if you ever heard of it, there's a thin line between genius and insanity. And I don't mean that as an insulting way, but it's just saying that That always, even as a kid, I didn't understand that. Why would someone be so gifted and be genius, but then also be so sad that they commit suicide or turn to drugs, or, you know what I mean? And that was the story of many, many famous people. And I read a lot of those books when I was a kid, and I wanted to understand that. And so, a lot of what my mission now is about letting parents or individuals understand, whether they're in the autism community or dyslexic community or whatever, that the more gifted you are in an area, the more likely you are to develop an imbalance in other areas and other networks on the other side of the brain. And that can lead to these very big gaps between strengths and weaknesses. And that is really the nature of the problem. That is the root issue. And, letting people know that, someone or a parent, let's say, that has a child on the autism spectrum, that you didn't do anything wrong, like a lot of people feel like, that you gave your child an incredible gift. Usually the parents of kids with autism are extremely bright, extremely intelligent, as are the siblings. And the people that are autistic are the most intelligent in the family, but they also may be the ones that end up with a more severe imbalance. And that may lead to struggles that other people in the family don't have. And my goal is to first and foremost let people know that your child is a genius. And like even in the non-speaking end of it, as we talked, they are beyond geniuses. Every one of them is just unbelievably intelligent, smart, but they also are struggling with their body and other issues so much that it's preventing them from being able to speak and communicate and control their body. And my goal is to change that.
Whenever you're describing chiropractic or chiropractor, it's like the spine is very much doing that, isn't it? Because it's the central nervous system, but is the bridge between the body and the brain.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, when we look at human brains, evolutionary wise, and my first textbook the first thing I did was spend about 10 years really researching everything and put it into a textbook called Neurobehavioral Disorders from an Evolutionary Perspective. And when you look at, one of the first things I looked at is, where did brains come from on this planet? Like, why did they evolve to begin with? And the best researchers in the world at the time in that area, were saying that it really came down to movement, that, living things that don't move don't have a brain. Only living things that moved evolved a brain. And we know that, in neuroscience, there's a term: simple movement, simple brain; complex movement, complex brain. And the most complex brain is a human brain, and the most complex movement is bipedalism. And what is the key to bipedalism? It's the spine and the posture of the spine and the muscles. And achieving an upright posture changed the way that we utilize gravity as a power source to the brain to make it more powerful, bigger, faster. And so the spine is really that. This is all my research, and a lot of our textbook was looking at it, that the input from the spine and the muscles, and especially the neck, is the most important, most powerful, most ongoing input to the brain, and is unique in humans. And we know, when we're looking at evolutionary for humans, what's the thing that defines a hominid? It's bipedalism posture, right? So how does that relate to a unique brain? And they're directly tied to one another.
That's a fantastic discovery. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard anybody speak on it like that, especially on the depths of you are. So what happens after that with your research?
Well, after my textbook, we started, then doing, in the textbook, we create the really underlying model in theory. And really what we were searching for was a universal model that would speak to all neurodivergent and mental health issues, from a developmental perspective. And so, we did that. Now the idea was, okay, we need to prove it, meaning let's go out there and do the actual research. And in the early 90s, when a lot of, when new brain imaging came out and we could look at the brain in different ways functionally, it became aware that it really was, different issues weren't because of damage or injury. You look at an autistic brain with an MRI and it looks perfectly normal for the most part. And, you don't, the idea of it being a brain injury is completely wrong. It's not at all. But what you do see are differences in what's called functional connectivity, the way networks develop and the way networks communicate is a little bit different. And what we've been able to show as we've gone on over 30 years and, published over 100 papers on this is that, really the search for what is actually happening in the brain. What is autism? What is ADHD? What is dyslexia? And what is actually happening? How does it relate to the symptoms? And then, how can we improve it to be able to create more of a balance or improve that functional communication so that, we can really help that person become the best version of themselves, right? How do we rehabilitate that process without losing that person or their gifts or their uniqueness, and do it in a way that's respectful, but understand that the brain is the source of it all. And all the things that happen in the body, the gut, the immune system, it's all related to the brain. But a lot of that research hadn't been done. So we needed to tie that all together and really look at, it's really been the search for what's the root cause, what starts it all, how do you describe the problem, and then how can you change it? Like, one of the things that's never been answered really in the autism community is, why can't these people speak, right? When many of them are hyperlexic, meaning they can read before the age of 2, right? I have one child from England that could read at 7 months, but couldn't speak. So the area that reads in the left brain is basically the same area that generates words. So why can't they speak? No one's ever really answered that question. And that's something that I wanted to answer, from a really detailed neuroscience perspective. And I think we've been able to do that with our research better than anybody else at this point, because now we're in a position to say, okay, how do we change it? How do we give them their voice if that is possible?
Yeah, I love how you describe that you're going to the root cause and upstream. I think a lot of research and interventions, so forth, go too far downstream and everything looks more confusing downstream.
You're exactly right. I mean, most people they're just managing symptoms and behaviors because they don't know what the root cause is. They don't know what's actually happening in the brain. And autism in particular is an area of research because it's the most perplexing, right? It's definitely the most complex of any mental health, issue out there. It's incredibly complex, even more complex than most people realize when you start getting into the non-speaking world and you see their level of intellect. And so, they're just about managing symptoms. And as you said, it's all downstream. And when you go downstream, there's all these different issues going on that seem not interconnected. And medicine, today, especially more than ever, is about looking at individual specialized pieces. And the brain and the body is an integrated system. And you cannot understand something as complex as autism if you don't really have great knowledge of the whole integrated system. So again, a lot of my journey has been education. I have 2 doctorate degrees, a master's degree, and I've spent my whole career educating myself and doing different degrees in different areas so that I can understand not only the brain and the nervous system, but also the gut and the immune system and the autonomic system. And, all of these systems, the motor, the sensory, understand it. It's why I got a degree in neuropsychology, so I can understand how do you measure these things objectively, like, and what is actually happening. And as you said, most people and most parents, they're looking at it downstream. It's a great way that you put it, and they see all these fires that they're trying to put out without saying, okay, what's the source, and not and understanding that there is really one source, and it's in the brain, and it starts in brain development, and it starts with a phenotype, and it starts with a trait that is this brilliant left brain dominant trait. And and then this can create an imbalance, and a lot of it starts with, as we said, movement is what created brains. Movement is what creates human brains. And one of the unique vulnerabilities of the human brain is because we have the biggest brain per body size of any primate, but because we're bipedal, we have the smallest birth canal by far. So that means that we have really big heads with a really small birth canal. No other animal has to navigate that. And so, therefore, every other animal, almost all of their brain is developed in the womb in a controlled setting. And when they come out, it's almost adult size. Human brains are only about 20 or 25% of adult size at birth. That means 75 to 80% of our brain development happens outside the womb. And that means that all those stages, coming out, going through the birth process, rolling over, latching on, being able to crawl, being able to, walk at the right time, being able to talk and point and eye contact and movement, all of those milestones matter, especially in the first 6 years of life, and especially in the first year. And so if any deviation, because the brain and the human brain is so dynamic and so vulnerable, it can throw off this developmental sequence, and that can result in these imbalances, which is really at the root cause of most issues.
So let me ask, I wasn't planning on going here, but now that it's been brought up a little bit, is the difference between the human baby, the infant, perinatal, versus like our close so-called relatives as far as genetic patchwork goes, like bonobos and chimps and so forth, we're very much different. Like we can't survive. We can't even sit up as a human. So I think one that kind of tells us that's probably not genetics, but how much of it do you think is kind of developing and why before the birth? Or do you think it's more perinatal and that critical period leading up to the critical period?
I think because most of our brain develops outside the womb, that the most important factor is how we interact with our environment and utilizing that. So the human brain cells, so we know that basically 84% of the genes in the human genome are active during brain development. So most of our genes play a role in brain development more than any other animal. And so there is a genetic component. We know that those genes are mostly what we call experience dependent genes, which means they're dependent on environmental experience to activate them, literally turn them on. So the genes that regulate the brain are the most sensitive because we need to know to not grow the brain too much inside the womb. If the brain grew too early and too aggressively, we wouldn't get out. So our genes have to be sensitive to know when not to really grow too much so that we can get out. And then they need to know when they're out and be able to go, okay, now grow like crazy so that we go from 20% to 90% in the first 3 years of growth. And so what we see, and that's not creating new cells, it's mostly creating networks and communication and connectivity. So Our genes that regulate the brain are unique. Our brains are unique. The development of our brains are unique. But what it does is it means that our brain and our genes are much more dependent and interactive with the environment, which is a huge advantage because, one researcher has said that the human brain is the Swiss Army knife of brains, meaning our brains are more adaptable, so we can adapt to any environment more quickly and more effectively than any other animal. So that is something from a survival perspective that is very advantageous. But it means that if we don't have the proper environmental input at the right time, it can also be a disadvantage. And that's why other animals don't suffer as much from things like schizophrenia or autism, or because their brains don't have that capacity and they don't have the vulnerability. They don't have the upside and they don't have the downside that our brain potentially has.
Yeah, we have a steep gradient, and our environments have changed quite a bit over the last 130 years, or
One of the
even
reasons one of the
whatever.
reasons why we see a huge change in the landscape of neurodivergence is because of that environment change has been dramatic, especially in the last 30 years with the advent of technology, computer technology, the World Wide Web and all of that. And, Ian McGilchrist, I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's a psychiatrist out of the UK, and, he writes a lot about brain asymmetry and its relationship to psychiatry. But he's also published a couple of big volumes recently on more from a philosophical standpoint. Why are we seeing some of these mental health issues increasing? And he talks about how we're moving much more towards a left brain dominant world. As we moved in Western society from a hunter gatherer lifestyle to a lifestyle that was more about, reading and science and, in the industry, and then move more and more to technology, we move more towards a left brain style of thinking. And so what we see now is that, our society, our school, the way we teach kids, everything about what we do feeds our left brain and does not feed our right brain. And so it leads to an environment that can create these imbalances more. And it's also favoring the development of people that are more left brain dominant. That we're getting more people getting together and having children that really are both more left brain dominant. In the old days, a lot of people that were very left brain dominant that didn't have a way of communicating, they might be homebodies, or they might stay home and read a lot, and they're very, not very social, and they're much more introspective, and they may never really met each other. Now, with college campuses and campuses like Google and Apple, and, where we can communicate via computer and online dating, it's fostering people to be able to find one another like that. And it's favoring it in society. In autism, most people don't realize as you go up the socioeconomic scale, as you have higher degrees, and as you live in better neighborhoods, you're more likely to have a child with an autism diagnosis because it's a byproduct of this high intellect phenotype trait. Simon Baron-Cohen out of England, out of Cambridge, wrote a book called Autism and the Technical Mind. That it's been shown that in the families of people with autism, there's many more people that are physicists, mathematicians, engineers, or especially computer technology. So anywhere in the world, like you have a cluster of people in the IT world, like Silicon Valley has the highest concentration of autism in the world. Why? Because that phenotype, that engineering type brain is the foundation, that is the phenotype of autism. And if you get two people that have that, and they have a child that even has a stronger version of that phenotype, it leads to more vulnerability, especially in a world that from the moment of birth doesn't really build the right brain the way it needs to be.
Okay, so I want to talk about the sensory processing and orienting our attention to the environment. I also want to talk about functional connectivity. So let's just start with the functional connectivity, I think, since you brought it up. And what is your best research and information on which networks? Is there common networks kind of abnormal or different, I should say, or like hyperconnected? And why is that, you think?
Sure. Our research shows that it all goes back to development and maturity. And as we said, movement is what initiates it, right? And so, what a lot of my expertise, and I think I'm probably considered the world expert right now, is in early development movement. There's something called primitive reflexes. Primitive reflexes are these reflexive movement that we're born with in the womb, help us get out of the womb, and help lead us through the first year of movement and development and activating our genes. And they're well documented. They go back over 100 years. We've known about them. Pediatric neurologists look at them in the first year of life. Pediatricians used to look at it. And so what started coming out in the research many years ago was that there maybe these reflexes aren't going away. So they're there to lead us through that first year of movement and development. And then they need to go away. And it was becoming more noticed by many clinicians that if they checked, many of these reflexes weren't gone in kids with developmental issues. And likewise, we know that many of these kids were clumsy and awkward and physically had low muscle tone, weird ways in which they'd hold a pen, and their posture was poor, and they have head tilts and body tilts. And so we knew that there was a motor component, fine motor, gross motor coordination, but no one really kind of tied it together. And so it became recognized that these reflexes may not be going away, and that they may have something to do with, the foundational issue. But nobody really looked at it and said, all right, well, can we document for sure that they don't go away? Because in traditional medicine and traditional neurology, these reflexes go away at 100% of the time without fail. There's no such thing as retained reflexes. So my lab, what we wanted to do was, first of all, prove that no, these reflexes often don't go away. And then the next question was, okay, well, if they don't go away, what does that mean? What does that actually end up doing to the brain? How does it actually affect the brain? And how does it relate to autism in particular? And also, what's been noted is that some of these reflexes, which are always naturally symmetrical, when you examine people, they're often asymmetrical, meaning that you see them gone. They may be inhibited on one side but retained on another. And what does that mean? And so what we were able to show, really with a pretty extensive study, is that these reflexes often don't go away, and in autism, in almost virtually 100% of the cases we saw, there are some retained reflexes, if not all of them, to varying degrees, which has something to do with the varying in the spectrum level of severity, right? There's also what it does is when these reflexes don't go away, it prevents the next level of complex movement, and it keeps the brain in an immature state. But also, it has a disruptive effect on this normal sequence of the right brain taking the lead in development in the first 3 years and keeping the left brain down, and then allowing the left brain to come up and keep the right brain down, forming the foundation of the brain asymmetry. And it leads to it alters that sequence. And in autism, what happens is that when the reflexes don't go away, it keeps both sides of the brain down, And so the right brain loses its advantage. And in kids that are unusually gifted in their left brain, the left brain comes online too early. And now it pushes the right brain down. And now it developed this developmental imbalance. And that is when people regress in autism, when they lose these skills that they're developing. That's what's happening. And then what we see are these early left brain skills come online, like being able to read, or stimming, or tics, or hyperactivity, or tantrums, or chronic inflammation, or eczema. All of that is because of the left brain coming up and the right brain going down. And once that's established, it doesn't self-correct. And so this disrupts the normal flow of communication. So it all comes down to maturity, and the brain stays in an immature state, and the asymmetry of the reflexes reflects this asymmetry of this maturity imbalance. And all of the phenotypical differences and behaviors, gifts and weaknesses all lie in that imbalance. And there are different networks that are involved. So it's not always just the same networks, but there are different networks that are involved. And depending on what networks are involved more is where we see more of the different spectrum of autism lying in there. That's why there's different presentations of the same root problem. And ultimately, even at a lower level with maturity, what we've been able to show is that when the brain matures, not only is there this sequential difference, but also initially the brain connects with what we call short range connectivity, local connectivity. And this is where we form hubs and networks. And this is where, we form the foundation of the network. And these small connections are local, but they're very powerful. After we develop these networks and we segregate the brain into these localized networks and areas, then we need to lose some of those local connections and replace them with long range connections, so that we can now start integrating the networks and integrating the hemispheres, so that we can work in a very smooth and efficient and fast way. The analogy I use it is, I live on Long Island. In the town I live here, I have a lot of these short little roads that connect different parts of my town, right? And if I want to drive from one part of my town to the other, I use those little short roads, and it's very fast. But if I want to go to another area of Long Island and I use the back roads of every little town, it's going to take forever. So I jump on a highway that connects me on a long range fast, and it improves the efficiency and the connectivity. And the way they decide how that works is through what we call graph theory, right? That's how we figure out those efficiencies. So what we know in the autistic brain and in most developmental issues, and we've proven this, is that there is a deficit of long range connections, and they have too many short range connections, which means that, and why is that? Because their brain is immature. As the brain matures, we lose, and the brain waves get faster and less powerful. So what we've also proven is that in autistic brains, the brain waves are slower, which is what you see in small children, right? Smaller children, younger brains have more delta and theta, and more mature brains have more alpha and beta and gamma. We've shown that in all ages that the autistic brain is more delta and theta based, especially on the right side of the brain. Why? Because it's immature, not because it's damaged. And so these short range connections are very, they have slower brain waves, but they're very powerful. They have a lot of electric power. So this is where we see that there's hyperconnectivity, especially in the left side of the brain, and there's hypoconnectivity of the long range connections, and especially between the two hemispheres of the brain. So this is what's happening and it's been shown that, that ratio of short range to long range, when you go from a small brain like a mouse to a human brain that's very large, that ratio has a logarithmic scale to it that's really miraculous. It's unbelievable, actually. But there's a very specific ratio of long range to short range connections at every size of the evolutionary brain. And in the human brain, the ratio is very specific for the optimal brain function. And it's been shown that just a little deviation of that, a 5 or 10% deviation on long range to short range, can be the difference between someone functioning at the highest level we can imagine to someone functioning at a lower level. But if you look at the brain, there's the exact same amount of connections and there isn't any damage. And you won't see anything in the brain. The only thing you would be able to, if you can functionally measure the ratio of these short range to long range connections, that's the only way it becomes apparent. And we've been able to show that that's exactly, and other people have shown this as well, that that's exactly one of the foundational issues in autism. And it all comes back to immaturity of the brain.
Okay, so like these short localized hubs or connections, I should say, stay there because the brain prefers to send signals to activate what it knows because these connections are growing in size, I'm assuming, and staying localized. So if that's the preference of the brain, then that's what's going to keep us there. And it's very much aligned with that early development time frame. Like they're just stuck. Okay, I follow. That's very
So because we get stuck in our movement, right? We get stuck because these reflexes aren't going away. And that holds so we stay in a more immature state. And so our brain is immature. And that's what we've been able to show. The autistic brain is a more immature looking brain. That's the only difference, really. But the features of that is really that as part of the immaturity, we see that it's not necessarily size, because an immature brain can actually be a bigger brain. We actually lose cells as the brain matures and it becomes efficient, but it's a less efficient brain, but long range efficiency. Short range efficiency, it's more efficient and more powerful, which underlies a lot of the savant level skill that's there. But it also disrupts this normal sequence of right and left development. And so we get this favoring left brain side and not right brain. And so that also disrupts that long range connectivity. And this is what leads to the different, and depending on what networks exactly are different, what are overactive, what are underactive, really leads to the various variety of symptoms that we see, not only in the autism community, but in the entire neurodivergent world.
yeah, those are all just downstream. And then we can, how they manifest is we can label a phenotype on those.
Exactly.
Okay. So with these problems with these distal connections, especially for like the prefrontal cortex, that's very distal from those sensory processing areas like the brainstem and the thalamus. The thalamus is deep inside the brain. So how do you kind of provide intervention to strengthen that myelination? Is there anything that stands out?
Absolutely. It starts with the bottom up. That's the thing. A lot of people go right to the top down, right?
You got to get there first.
Right. So the foundation never was built appropriately. And so you need to go back to the beginning. That's why understanding the root cause. So what is blocking the maturity and the development of the brain? It's these reflexes that never went away and preventing really more complex, purposeful movement. And it's this imbalance. Those two things are at the root. So we need to remove what the blockage is. So the first thing we do is work on remediating these reflexes. And there's a series of physical activity and stimulations, not exercises, because many of these kids, because their right brain is so deficient, they can't move their body on their own. To try to make them do exercises is not going to work. So we have to do it to them. And we stimulate the reflexes to get them to become integrated and eventually then lead them into being able to having more complex, purposeful, coordinated movement. We also want to stimulate their senses in a way to activate the right brain and inhibit the left brain and promote that crosstalk. And then we want to then do things cognitively to them to activate the right brain and inhibit that left. We do things like, electrical devices like transcranial, which can literally do that, or lasers or magnets. But we have to start with the bottom up. If you're just doing that and you're not working on the foundational root problem with the reflexes and with movement and with sensory stimulation and processing and balancing, that's not going to stick. And you've actually said that, it just doesn't stick. And also you need to understand the nature of the imbalance. Like a lot of people that do brain stimulation therapies, they automatically assume that a child with autism or an adult that can't speak has a left brain language deficit. They don't. And they stimulate the left brain, which is already overactive, and they make it worse. Whereas you need to stimulate the right brain and literally inhibit the other side of the brain. So, that's why understanding the nature of the problem is so critical. And that same area, which is called Broca's area or Brodmann area 44 and 45 on the left, which is where we have expressive verbal language, right near that is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and orbital, which causes OCD. And right behind that is Brodmann area 6, the premotor area on the left, which is what causes tics and stimming and repetitive behavior. So if you go there and you stimulate it, you're not only not going to correct the language problem, but you're probably going to make the OCD and the tics worse. So this is where taking this knowledge of neuroscience and functional neuroscience at the highest level and turning it into a treatment that's actually going to address the issue is really what my whole career has been about. And that's the whole basis of the Melillo Method.
Okay. You mind walking us through that as much detail as you want to give?
Yeah, sure. Well, like I said, it starts off with a proper evaluation. The thing is like seeing if reflexes are retained. There's not a lot of people that are trained properly to do that. I've trained over 10,000 health professionals around the world, but, being able to most effectively check for these reflexes, it requires a really good physical exam. So you can't do it virtually. So that's one of the challenges. But, we look and do a really good exam and do functional measurements to put everything on a functional developmental scale, because any sort of intervention approach needs to be goal directed and it needs to be objectively measurable, right? A lot of the treatments that are out there are just trying to manage symptoms and they're a hope and a prayer. Let's try this and see if it changes anything. What do we mean change? Well, let's see if their symptoms are less. Okay, well, why are their symptoms there? What is the issue to begin with? And whereas our approach is about, looking at the whole person, looking at the whole integrated system. We do a really good neurodevelopmental exam. We do all different types of other measurements cognitively, sensory-wise, sensory processing. We'll do brain mapping. We do lab work that looks at immune markers and inflammatory markers and things like food sensitivities. We look at the whole individual person And then we individualize a program to really kind of address the issues at the root cause and correct imbalance, targeting the specific networks in that individual and targeting their specific needs. Like, people are often told that the problem starts in the gut. It doesn't. It starts in the brainstem and the brain with the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which is what regulates gut development. And because the brain doesn't develop the way it should, the parasympathetic nervous system in many of these kids and adults doesn't come online. So they stay in this fight or flight state, and their gut stays open and leaky. We start out life with a leaky gut. That's the way we're born. It's supposed to be that way because babies don't form antibodies when they're first born. So they need, about 6 months to a year before they start developing their own antibodies. And they need antibodies, and they get it through the mom's breast milk. But antibodies are big, large proteins that wouldn't get through a normal stomach lining. So the gut needs to be more porous and open and leaky to allow these large proteins through. Then we also can't produce a lot of acid and enzymes during that time because those acids would kill those antibodies in the gut. So the sympathetic nervous system, when it's on, makes our heart rate really fast and also keeps our gut shut down. But as the brain matures and as the brainstem matures, as the reflexes go away, the parasympathetic nuclei come on, and that starts to shut down the sympathetic fight or flight. The heart rate drops, the gut closes up. We produce acid and enzymes that promotes the proper environment for good bacteria and kills all the bad things and the bad bugs like parasites or fungus or mold that shouldn't be able to live in our body, and now increases blood flow so we can absorb nutrients and vitamins and minerals to help our brain and body grow more. But what we know and what we've also proven is on the autism spectrum and in most developmental issues, that parasympathetic nervous system never fully comes on, and they stay in this fight or flight. And so they do have a leaky gut. They do have inflammation, and they do have food sensitivities, and they have vitamin and mineral deficiencies and, folic deficiencies. But that's not the root cause. It doesn't mean that we don't need to address those things. We do. But the ultimate solution is to get the brain and get the sympathetic and parasympathetic and right and left, because they control sympathetic and parasympathetic differently. The right brain activates the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, and the anti-inflammatory part of the immune system. The left brain activates the sympathetic and inflammatory part. So these kids are in an inflamed state. But again, it really all comes down to the brain and the nervous system. But most people in the biomedical world have no idea of the neuroscience. They know nothing about it. So, they just know there's inflammation and there's a leaky gut and there's vitamin and mineral deficiencies and they have these bugs in their gut. And so that's causing autism. No, that's not the way it works.
Yeah, okay. I just want to check my understanding here, and I'm kind of adding something into it. Just wanting to check though, does the role of the excitation inhibition imbalance play a role, and the reticular formation of through the brainstem and so forth?
Yeah, it's a little bit more complex than just the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system actually activates the brain more through the thalamus, through what we call the intralaminar nuclei in the thalamus, which is these are non-specific nuclei that activate the brain and generate most of the foundational brain waves, but especially the gamma waves. And gamma waves is the ultimate signal. When we're at our highest cognitive functional level, the linking signal that really links things together fast is the gamma rhythm between 40 to 60 hertz. And that is all generated through that. So the reticular activating system goes into the intralaminar nuclei in the thalamus and then up to the brain. And the two thalami are like oscillators. They're constantly, they create the pulsation that the brain is pulsating at, and they're completely independent. So the right and the left are different. And that's where part of the desynchronization or dysrhythmia comes from. Because ultimately, what we're talking about in functional connectivity is a problem with desynchronization or dysrhythmia, where the synchronized signals, the timing is off. You have one side of the brain oscillating at a much faster rate than the other, and they can't communicate. It's like, having an old computer try to talk to a new computer. Not because there's nothing wrong with either one of them, but they're different processing speeds. They can't communicate because of the processing difference. And so that's part of it. So what we see is that, trying to change the speed of that processing and the maturity, the brain becomes faster as we mature. And a lot of those signals originate in the body and in the muscles, and especially in the muscles along the spine.
Okay. All right. That's a great perspective there with the root of the GI problem.
Well, the GI problem really, is there. So, when we approach the Melillo method, again, we're looking at it all, right? We're not just looking at the brain. We recognize that we have to look at the whole body, but we're also looking at it. What is the foundational issue that we need to address? And doing that in a measurable way. And so looking at the gut and the immune system is all important. But if that's all you're doing, you're not really dealing with the root cause. And so it's about looking at motor system and sensory processing and the immune system and the balance within the immune system of what we call the Th1 and Th2 systems and the antibodies versus the white blood cells. And then looking at the gut and the detoxification system and the vitamin and the minerals and enzymes and all of that. But the reason why there's the root issue really comes down to looking at the brain and the brainstem and this maturity and this development of this functional connectivity and this synchronization of the brain.
Okay. How long have you had this Melillo method kind of available?
Well, I started working with this and started really researching this. I started working, as I said, in the neurology and development work and teaching clinical, neurology back in the, mid 80s, late 80s. I started really functioning on understanding what's happening in the brain development and learning and mental health area in the early 90s and started developing a program of how to change it, around 1995. And so I've been working with it since then, evolving it. I created a program called the Brain Balance Program, which is a more kind of non-medical type of approach. And I started a company called Brain Balance Achievement Centers. And, we developed over 100 centers across the country that is still in existence today. But that was more with milder, kind of higher functioning issues that were a little less challenging. And but I really wanted to understand and work with the most challenging, especially non-speaking autism. And I wanted to work with all ages, including adults. And so my research went on, my education went on, my experience got more and more. I continue to teach and write. I've written 8 best-selling books on the topic. And ultimately, the Melillo method evolved out of that as a much more complex version um, of that really could address any age and any level of challenge. And that has been really evolving and being utilized over the past 10 years in my centers here in New York. And now we're actually starting to expand that around the world. We're going to be starting centers in different countries very shortly because we want to bring this technology out wherever people need to be. So right now we're going to be developing a center in Colombia, Sydney, Australia. We have one now, and Mexico City very shortly, and then from there.
It's a great success and obviously a very important topic. Could you say a little bit before we wrap up about the nonverbal speaker? And because I just appreciate so much about how you were talking about how their intelligence is in there and so forth. About some of the Melillo method, I know it's very individualized, but some of the more common things that you do with the nonverbal.
Yeah. So to me, that was the most fascinating, and what really opened the door to me on understanding this was when I started working with a woman who does spelling, and she is a child that I had worked with, and for 20 years she was working on spelling with him, and opened the world. And honestly, I've been exposed to it years before. And like many parents, I looked at it, and because my understanding of the problem and the root cause wasn't sophisticated enough, I looked at it and I thought, oh, that's BS. That kid doesn't know that. How would they know that? They don't know anything. So how could they be spelling these complex sentences? And it looks like somebody's guiding their hand. And I thought, okay, that's not real. And then as I understood, and as my search for really understanding why they can't speak evolved, and really, we published a paper on that. I understood that the root cause is that they don't know where their body is. They're not building these sensory motor maps in the right side of their brain. And it's not a lack of words, and it's not a lack of speech on the left side of the brain. And then I met somebody who explained it to me in neuroscience terms that, we're not guiding their hand. When we touch them, now they know where their hand is and they can spell because the words are there. And that really resonated with me because I went, wow, okay, that's exactly where my model is going. And that made sense to me because now you're not guiding them, or even you're actually resisting them. And that feedback allows them for the first time to know where their own hand is. And now they can spell. But the words and everything are already there because they're so brilliant. And so now we work with, hundreds and hundreds of kids like this. And I ask them questions. Like, I love asking them questions. Like, the first question I ask them is, why can't you speak? And they'll tell you if you ask them. But nobody, even the parents, don't ask them that question. Even people that are spelling, I say, have you ever asked them? And they tell me the same thing. I don't feel my body. I can't move my body. One kid described it perfectly. I mean, neuroscience, so we developed something called a homunculus.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Right. So as we're developing in the right brain, in the parietal lobe, we develop what's called a sensory homunculus, which is a distorted 3D map of the body. And in the right brain, we have a whole body because we've become a whole person through the development of what we call interoception and proprioception. And then once we develop a sensory map in the parietal lobe, we then develop a motor map in the frontal lobe of how to move that part of our body. And the biggest part of the map by far, like 1/3 of the whole map, is the face, the mouth, the tongue, and the lips. And then the next third is the arm and the hand and the finger for fine motor and pointing. And so the hardest thing they have, and they tell us, these kids started telling me, I don't feel my tongue in my mouth. I don't feel my face. I don't feel my body. I don't know where my body is. I don't realize I have a body. I don't know where my hand is. That's why, you ask them to point to something, they can't point, or they may point to something completely, that they know the answer, but they can't point to it. They can't write, they can't type. But it's not because the words aren't there. Their words are beyond other people. And so hearing them tell me this by typing was unbelievable, because now they were confirming everything that I thought. And I literally, I had them look at videos that I've created and said, am I right? Is this why you can't speak? And they were like, absolutely. You're the only one that has ever said this to us, that this is actually the reason why. And they're so brilliant. I trust them more than I do most other doctors and scientists to give me the right answer and to critique my work. And, they give me the most fascinating, and they literally describe, they'll say to me, there's a battle going on between my right and left side. And the left brain is too dominant, and it won't give up control, and it won't let that right brain come up. And that is exactly what's happening in their brain. And this is their words, they're typing, they're saying this. And it's really unbelievably amazing. And it's something that I continue to want to research and understand it. And, and they all say, almost all of them will say, please help me speak. Please help me stop stimming. They want that, right? So, that's my goal, is to try to give them the voice. And the majority of the time we do. The majority of the time we do give them the ability to speak. Not always fully, but they're able to speak and communicate at a much higher level. And the longer we work with them, the more that changes. So that's probably my greatest accomplishment, is to be able to do that for somebody.
Yeah, I love that, because I was going to ask you about that as soon as you were talking about it. Because somatosensory and then the motor cortex,
Right.
right there on
Yeah,
top of each other,
exactly.
and the
And
thalamus is
but you won't develop the motor map until you develop the sensory map,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And one kid said it to me perfectly. I said to him, why can't you speak? And he said, I don't see my body in my brain. And so therefore I can't move my body myself the way I want to. They stim, they tick, they move, they look like they're doing complex movement, but none of it is under their control.
yeah,
It's just automated actions, and they don't even want to be doing most of the things that they're doing. And, again, this is what they tell us. And if you've read books, there's a lot of really good books out there by non-speaking adults that have, can type and spell. And this is how they describe it. This is absolutely. And they tell me all the time, that this treatment is helping me, and they've helped guide me to tell them, do this way, and help me get better.
yeah. I would anticipate the indirect pathway of the basal ganglia is also involved, because the brain stem, the substantia nigra, up to the dorsal striatum and things. They can't shut these motor movements off.
Well, one of the things that most people in neuroscience, and especially clinical, aren't aware of, you're exactly right. There's a deficiency of the indirect pathway, and there's an overactivity of the direct pathway. But the indirect deficit is more related to the fact that there's a hyperdirect pathway. You're familiar with that. The hyperdirect pathway is only in the right side of the brain.
I wasn't aware of that.
And so, yes, it's only in the right side. It's in the right sensory motor area, which is where tics and stimming are stopped, and hyperactivity. And it's in the right inferior frontal gyrus, which is what regulates OCD and emotional outbursts, right? So those two hyperdirect pathway only go to the indirect pathway, and in particular to the subthalamic nucleus of Lewy. And so when you don't have a right brain development, you don't develop the hyperdirect pathway. You don't develop those inhibitory connections in the basal ganglia, and you have too much activating excitatory, and the left brain is more connected to the direct pathway and the dopamine pathways, and the left brain is more dopaminergic and excitatory. So you talked about the excitatory and the inhibitory imbalance. The right brain is inhibitory, the left brain is excitatory. Dopamine is more excitatory, serotonin is more inhibitory. And so that is where all of the stimming and the tics. And so there's 5 primary pathways in the basal ganglia in that balance. And one of them is from Brodmann area 6, the supplemental premotor area in the left brain that goes into the basal ganglia. The left brain activates the direct pathway and turns on stereotypical movement, programmed complex movement, and the right brain inhibits that through the hyperdirect indirect pathway. When you don't have that right side, that left brain is unregulated, and that's why they have tics and stimming, and same thing with OCD. That's where it comes from.
Yeah. It's like flip the light switch. It's just sitting there constant, flip the light switch. But it has to recruit the basal ganglia to actually do the motor movement. I'll flip the light switch. That's fantastic. Why don't you tell us how people can get a hold of you?
Let me ask you something. I know
Yeah.
you've spoken, you like to speak about neuroscience, and you said you've spoken to neuroscientists on this podcast before, and I think it's great. How many other neuroscience know this? How many other neuroscience know that aspect of what's happening in the brain and the basal ganglia as a root issue related to autism, do you think?
Not enough. Not enough at all.
Really, almost none.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And most neuroscientists are not clinicians. How many clinicians you think understand that?
No, none.
None.
Absolutely none.
That's where people say to me, how do you know this stuff? Or how are you coming up with these unique ways? Because you understand. I understand the neuroscience and functional neuroscience probably as well as anybody in the world. And also, I've been a clinician working at this for 35 years. And combining this together is really the key. And, that's my goal, is to teach others this and put it out there to lead the way. But I think you realize this is where healthcare has to go, especially brain health, the integration of understanding it. And that's where a lot of the confusion is out there. Because again, there's very few to no clinicians that understand the neuroscience in a functional, complex way. And most neuroscientists don't understand functional neuroscience and don't work with patients. So they don't understand what this actually looks like clinically and what would I do about it. They have no idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's lacking bad. And it's the silos. It's a product of the silos, and the basal ganglia is really central to. I have a lot of episodes on the basal ganglia because it's very fascinating. And
well, just so you actually know, again, everything I talk about, I've published papers and research. So our paper on the basal ganglia and going through exactly what we just described is one of the most downloaded papers in all of neuroscience on basal ganglia.
okay.
So if you go, it's an open access. If you look at my name under basal ganglia, the paper that we go to describe this, and a lot of other papers, because I go into the basal ganglia in most of our papers. And like I said, one of my best papers really is really describing in detail the neuroscience of autism. And so, reading up on the basal ganglia, our paper is one of the leading papers ever published on the basal ganglia and how it relates to these issues. So, I'm not just saying this. This is something that, we've published at the highest level.
Yeah, the basal ganglia has to be involved. It's our goal. Go, no go. And it's not talked about it.
No. And people don't understand the laterality of it. They don't understand the difference. and the way that the right brain and the left brain interact with the basal ganglia, even though it's clearly out there. Look up the hyperdirect pathway and you'll understand that it's only in the right side of the brain.
One of those with the lack of knowledge on the left and the right with this. So fantastic. I love it because this is
A lot of neuroscientists are, and a lot of neuroscience because they really look at just the computational neuroscience piece. And that's the thing. When you look at these subtle differences between long range and short range connectivity over the whole brain, these are subtle little microscopic differences that individually don't really add up to much. But over the whole brain,
yeah,
it adds a lot behaviorally, right? The phenotype that is. But when you look neuroscience only at the computational part of analyzing the connections and everything, you don't really see the big differences between the right and left brain. And so a lot of modern neuroscientists are more like, oh, the whole right brain, left brain thing isn't really a big deal. Where most of, a lot of neuroscience in the background in the past really documented it. But if you really look at it from a behavioral perspective, it's the biggest piece. It is what makes the human brain most unique. So there's a lot of conflict even within the neuroscience community. And again, that creates confusion out there in the public with people that hear, oh, that right brain, left brain thing isn't a big deal anymore. No, it's a huge deal. And it's getting even bigger in the world that actually researches it and understands it.
it makes sense. If you think about it, there's contralateral for a reason, except for the pineal. Everything else is contralateral, correct?
Exactly. It's an advantage. You should definitely read some of Ian McGilchrist's work. One book, his first book was called The Master and His Emissary, the development of Western civilization, Western civilization and the divided brain. And just, his work and my textbook, I think, are foundational. But the only thing is that, Ian is great and he's incredibly, his writing is beautiful, but he doesn't have a solution for it, right? I came up with the solution based on it. And so that's the difference. But his writing and his information on it, and especially on brain asymmetry, is amazing.
Yeah, I very much appreciate your work with the clinical side and like the functional neuroscience side, because
Yes,
that's the path.
absolutely.
Earlier, you were talking about roads, and I love those analogies. And like that's the road.
Right. Yeah, well, let's spread the word out there through you and through other people like you and through your community, and we can create change. I mean, that's all we can do, right? We're in this world to hopefully make a difference. You're making a difference by what you're doing, and I'm making a difference. And I just, once you make a difference, you only want to make more of a difference, a positive difference, right? So, let's, this is what we do. We put our mind and manifest that, and we can make it happen.
Yeah, I hope, let's stay in touch, and because there's a lot of different things that we can really zoom into that I want to.
Absolutely. Love to.
Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Melillo, and I hope you have a great day.
My pleasure. You too.